Okay, great. Well, welcome to this session. This is treating children as children, even when they cause significant harm, and what keeps us safe. So we all know that science and research are really clear that children are fundamentally different from adults. But that doesn't mean that we don't hold young people accountable. But it does mean that we need to account for those differences between children and adults. So in this panel, we're going to talk about why we need to treat children like children, even when they cause significant harm. And we're going to talk about how to do this effectively. So joining us this morning for the conversation are 4 panelists bringing different but important perspectives. So I'm just going to ask each of them to just introduce themselves, and then we'll kick it off with some questions and discussion, and then we'll hear from the audience if you have questions. So why don't we start on this end?
Thanks, Administrator Ryan. I'm Cara Beckman. I work at the University of Minnesota at the Healthy Youth Development Prevention Research Center, where I do mostly applied research related to restorative justice and restorative practices.
Good morning, KJ. I'm the CEO of KJ 612 Outreach and Youth Council Program Manager at YouthLink, and done work with various nonprofits throughout the city doing community violence intervention for a while now. I coach youth basketball and youth boxing as well.
Good morning again, Sarah Davis with the Hennepin County Attorney's Office.
Can you all hear me? Because I'd rather not use these microphones. Curtis Shanklin, currently now at Metropolitan State University, associate professor. I was just previously deputy commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Corrections. I've been in this, what I call this criminal justice arena now for 20 plus years in many different facets, from working in detention facilities to probation, parole officer, and kind of everything in between. Appreciate you all being here today.
Great. Well, so let's start with what it means to treat children as children in the justice system. So KJ, I'm going to ask you to kick us off and then ask each panelist to share with us, what does that mean to you, treating children as children?
To me, that kind of means giving credibility to the science that the brains are not developed yet, and so if you put a child, youth whose mind is not developed as an adult would, into a system where they're around adults, they're vulnerable, susceptible to being manipulated, to being conditioned, I believe in being a product of your environment. And so therefore, if I take this youth who already is on a negative trajectory and put them around an environment where it's kind of sink or swim, then, what can you expect of them? Can you expect to have a youth who's already struggling, and already they have the ability to have that intervention and take a left or take a right turn instead of taking a left turn, and instead you throw them in an environment where they have to adapt, they have to accustom, and essentially they have to get more aggressive, get more violent, or become a victim.
Thank you. Who wants to go next? I'm just going to popcorn around.
Well, I just want to lift up what KJ shared, about the environment that we put young people into when we shift to treat them as adults. And Curtis is here, and he can talk a bit from a professional standpoint about what it looks like when a young person walks into an adult prison facility. And KJ can speak about that as well. But, from my perspective, we cannot treat young people as if they're just smaller adults, right? Everything that we know is that their brains are still developing actually until their mid-20s. I know Mary mentioned this earlier. The rest of the Western world, most of the rest of the world doesn't even bring kids into a justice system context, even a juvenile justice system context, until they're 14. That's the international standard. And before I joined the county attorney's office, I was in this work for 15 years representing children. And we all have been children, and even if you don't have your own children, we have children in our lives, right, that you're connected with. And I ask you to imagine for a moment what it's like to try to explain to a 10-year-old the trial process, and try and explain to an 11-year-old probation. These are just not concepts they're able to grasp. But then here in Minnesota, at 14, young people can be charged as adult and moved into the adult system, 14. I mean, we're talking about maybe a freshman in high school, maybe 8th grader. And I ask you to think about the people in your lives, the young people in your lives, and what that means, and to center that humanity when we talk about if we actually want to improve outcomes, and if we really do care about setting young people on a path to success, that treating them like adults, sending them into an adult system that's not equipped to account for their brain development, to account for their needs as children, is not gonna get us there.
I think I'll just kind of build on that, and we talk about this a lot when we talk about the My Child test, right? And probably if you've heard myself or Sarah or some of our other colleagues speak before, you've heard us talk about this concept, which really is about if it was your son or daughter, your niece or nephew, your grandson or granddaughter, how would you want their experience to be if they got caught up within the juvenile justice system, right? I think sometimes we separate our own family members from those youth, right, that either are portrayed a certain way through the media or are portrayed a certain way when we're talking about legislation or portrayed a certain way when we talk about policy, right? But I don't think anyone in here, and I'm being presumptuous, would say that, my niece I feel is irredeemable, right? Or my younger cousin I feel because of some of the choices they made is not worth an investment into their life, right? So why don't we apply these same concepts and principles to those kids, right? Because we'll talk about this a little bit later, because when we talk about the truth of the matter is how many youth are actually involved in this system for what we consider our Part 1 offenses, which are more serious criminal offenses. When we talk about homicides and other things like that, the vast majority of our youth are for what we consider our Part 2 offenses, right? And I think it also gets to the fact of understanding that, and you heard Eric talk about this too, our youth are a product of their environment, right? Our youth are also malleable, right? Irregardless of the choices that they make, there still is a belief that when given the right services, when put in the right environment, that youth can make meaningful change, right? And we say a lot of things, but the question is, do we really mean when we talk about our youth are the future, does that only apply to our youth? Or does that apply to those youth, right? And more often than not in the juvenile justice system, we're talking about Black and brown youth. But here in Minnesota, that's true for all youth. Even when you get out in rural Minnesota, and I've been all over these 87 counties, all the way from Roseville, and all the way down to the southern part of the state of Marshall, Minnesota, right? Because you have some of those youth too, who are not Black and brown, who are still having some of the same trauma and experiences and being a product of their environment, right? And so why does it matter? I mean, it matters because, again, if that is our future, then what are we really doing to ensure that they are put on the best track to be their most positive selves, their best selves, while also understanding that, just like all of us, they're going to make mistakes, right? And so I think it's incumbent upon us to continue to think about those kids as our kids. Because if we think about it through that lens, then you're probably willing to work a little bit harder. You're probably willing to go the extra mile. You're probably also willing to not subject yourself to the way these youth are portrayed through a media lens, right? Or through others who are using it as a messaging tool to either advance their own agenda, right? Or advance policies and things that we have simply accepted for decades that still haven't gotten us the results, that we're seeking. The last thing I'll say is, we talk about particularly those youth that come from marginalized communities. We'll sit here and we'll accept and say, there's disparities when it comes to health, when it comes to education, when it comes to socioeconomic status, right? But then we somehow become surprised when youth who come up in those environments make some of the choices that they make, right? All of that goes out the window. Well, how could that be? If we're going to continue to use those messaging talking points, then we should also have the same compassion for those youth who are coming up in those environments.
Karen?
I think, excuse me, a couple of things I'd add to the conversation is that treating children like children means having a whole lot of humility about what we're doing, because ultimately if we're gonna bring them into a system, we have to outperform what natural development will do, which means that 99% of them will, higher than 99% of them will grow out of this behavior anyway, and that we have to outperform what their children or what their families and community can do for them already. So we already know that young people who come into, have an initial contact with the legal system, 65 to 75% of them are not gonna come back, right? Like it was a mistake, they, will get the support and the accountability they need from their family, and they'll be kind of back on track and on their way. So like we gotta be mindful of what we have to outperform here and what we're taking on and taking away than, disempowering the family and communities that they grew up in and saying, we're gonna do better at this than you are. We have drastically failed on that, deal. And so if we're gonna double down on it, we gotta really, really be humble about what that's gonna look like. I think as folks have said, we have to drastically broaden the context with which we are understanding, seeing a young person's behavior and not look at a single incident, but really look at the whole of this young person's life and the choices we have made as a community to either invest or disinvest in the environment that they're growing up in, and therefore we have to hold some of that responsibility ourselves and be honest about that. And then finally, as folks have said, we really need to understand child and adolescent development in this conversation, both in terms of the factors that may play into a young person's behavior, and also the way responses will be received. And to understand what it means to be an early adolescent, a middle adolescent, and to grapple with how the tasks of adolescence as a really important developmental stage come up against this idea of imposed accountability. So we can get into that more later, but I think those would be my kind of core points at this point.
So you've each talked about what the importance of treating children as children is. Can you talk a little bit about, and we'll start with you, Kara, because you touched on it a little bit already, what does that mean in practice? What does it look like to treat children as children in the justice system?
Yeah, so I think, those two pieces it around understanding adolescent development, right, is both understanding what that science can offer us in terms of understanding behavior and what it can offer us in terms of understanding how different responses will be received. And so in terms of understanding behavior, we really, really need to figure out how to put into practice this idea that behavior is a communication of needs and it has coherence. So coherence as a core, foundational concept in child psychology means that young people's behavior can be understood if we look at it from their lens. And often we'll think about, maybe this young person was hungry or maybe they were tired, and so, we'll kind of give them that grace in certain situations, right? Like, oh, they stole, a $5 burrito, probably they were hungry, we can, give them grace. So, for certain needs and for certain ages and for certain harm, we'll give them grace. But then, when it just gets too big or too hard or too scary to really treat them as a child, we'll pull away from that. But ultimately, the social needs, the relational needs, the emotional needs, and what often we forget about are the developmental needs. So, adolescent development and adolescence is this really, really key stage that we just don't talk about in our public dialogues enough. Why is it that young people take risks? Why is it that young people, have trouble calculating, and thinking through like, oh, the consequence here is something that I should really be afraid of, right? All that stuff matters. And then when I feel like I did something wrong and I'm kind of struggling with the emotions around that and I'm not quite sure what to do, when somebody that I don't know imposes a consequence on me, like, that's not gonna, right? Like, I'm just going down this road of defiance and disconnection. And so the way we respond when, the way adolescents respond when somebody imposes a consequence, even when it's a consequence that the person is like, this makes sense, right? It makes sense to, go to tobacco addiction class when you were caught vaping in the bathroom, right? Like you know, people will say like, it's restorative because it's natural. Well, like, if it's imposed, it's not restorative, and if it's imposed, you know, 80% of your young people are gonna show up to that class and be like, you ain't got nothing, you know, I mean, we know how, we all showed up that way to certain things. So, you know, I'll speak for myself. I showed up that way to certain things that I was asked to do. So it's that, you know, understanding of behavior, and then the way in which, and so Mary touched on this a little bit, right? The way in which that has to, that it implies a totally different relationship to families and communities. Because if we are going to understand a child's need and understand the coherence behind their behavior and what they are communicating through their behavior, we have to have that conversation with somebody who knows them deeply and trusts us, right? We're not gonna be able to guess that through a, you know, or like calculate it through a risk and needs assessment that is like, was built for adults and then adapted for children, right? We have to have that in conversation with people who have a deep relationship for every individual child. So those would be kind of my prime, you know, so it implies a totally different level of trust with families and communities that we have to rebuild. Step there.
When I think of what that means and what that looks like, I think about what I experienced firsthand, what I saw firsthand, coming up through the system myself, and my introduction to being in juvenile detention centers was probably about 2003 when I was about 11 years old, and all of my friends, all my peers that I grew up with, so that graph that they had on there was no surprise to me when we saw those peak years being recently, but also back in 2006, 5, 7, 8, 9. And everybody I grew up with, I'd say majority that went through the system were all certified at one point. And to this day, you know, me being 32, to this day, all of them are either, we're talking about either in and out of prison since then, dead, just a lot of negativity, you know, a lot of terrible outcomes, you know, including my little brother who was certified as an adult, and he's in federal penitentiary right now to this day. He's been in prison. He's been in federal prison twice. He's been in state prison twice. My older brother who was certified as a juvenile, and he was murdered in 2015. After going back to prison and then come home. And, you know, just, like I said, I think about everybody that I grew up with who was certified and kind of cast away in a sense. And they spent the rest of their adult, to this day at least, they're still young adults, but they're in prison, or they're not here anymore, or they're fresh out right now and still struggling. And I think about myself and, you know, choices that I made and going into the system early on. I didn't get certified, but I went to prison at a young age, and it didn't do me any good. You know, like if I would have been sent, instead of being sent to strictly like a probation officer at the time, who I was a number to, instead you send me a credible messenger, a young man or an adult who could have mentored me and who looked like me and who came from the same circumstances as me, and hence the work that I do now in the community with it. I try to be that person that can tell them, hey, you can come from this and you can go this way still, and it still looks good, it still looks cool, you know, and it prevents you from, you know, all those trials and tribulations that you put yourself and your family through.
Can you just, thank you for sharing that. Can you share a little bit more about what a credible messenger is for the audience? Like, why is that important? Why is that a strategy you think would help us operationalize treating children as children?
Okay, so a credible messenger is somebody that essentially comes from where that youth comes from, that they're trying to reach, you know. So me, myself, I'm from the community. I went to prison. I've been in those circumstances. And a credible messenger doesn't have to have, you know, go to prison, for example, but they could have just been somebody who went through those kind of experiences. They grew up in that environment. They might have had a brother, an uncle, a cousin, a dad, you know, They come from that experience, that environment of the youth that they're trying to reach. And, you know, there's a lot of power in that. And I think about, you know, me going back and growing up without a father, you know, and that's something that could have made a difference in my life. There's one person I remember who was a social worker when I was young, and him just taking me to get a haircut meant a lot, but I didn't see him very often, you know, so like I imagine like if he would have been there more and he would have, you know, been able to take me to more haircuts, take me to my sports events, tell me, man, stay locked in, you know, stay locked in on this. You know, I was a gifted athlete at the time, but I was in the streets. And I didn't have that support, you know, and that's why I say, like, to me, that juvenile justice looks like, you know, offering those young folks those wraparound services, the ones that don't have it, you know, because if you put them in the system at a young age, I bet my money that they're gonna be in it at an older age as well, you know. You don't go in at 16, 15, 14 years old and come home in your early 20s and you're like, you know, I wanna be a lawyer, I wanna be a doctor now. You know, you like, well, I might do what I'm used to doing. All that I know, I just came from prison and they taught me how to sell drugs better. They gave me tips on, they gave me tips on criminality. Like, you know, you come through that environment, when you're raised in that environment, that's what you're taught. You don't go to prison and they tell you, you know, you should go home and go back to college. You know, you should go home and, you know, you're still young. You can still go home and still go to college. You can still play basketball, football if you want to, if you're an athlete. They don't tell you can do all that still. You know, but they do tell you, hey, look, I got a connect that does this or that. So that's what it looks like to me.
Thank you. Sarah?
Sure. You know, first I just want to acknowledge what KJ shared and thank you for bringing that, your experience into the space and being vulnerable to share that with folks. From my perspective, it looks like exactly what KJ is talking about, right? It's about seeing the humanity in every young person, even when they've caused significant harm, right? It looks about what Mary talked about earlier, right? And put up that slide. Having really hard conversations on an individual basis about young people who have found themselves in our system, who have caused really significant harm, and really trying to dig in and say, now what? And not discarding young people. So in practice, what that looks like is significantly reducing the use of adult certification and advocating at the legislature for policy changes that will allow jurisdiction in the youth justice system until young people are closer to their mid-20s, so that we don't have to use adult certification, right? Because we know the outcomes from that are not good. It also looks like a little bit what Cara was talking about. We know the vast majority of young people are gonna age out of the behaviors that bring them into the youth justice system. And we know that we can do that safely because that's what we do for our white folks who have wealth, right? Our youth justice system across this country, but here in Minnesota more specifically, brings low wealth Black and brown youth into the system and criminalizes what we know are neurotypical behaviors, right? And doesn't allow young people to learn and grow in community the way that we do with white children. So we know it's possible. So it looks like saying, actually, by touching this young person, this family with the youth justice system, we're setting them on a negative trajectory, so we're not gonna do that. It's about making those decisions, about digging into off-ramps, diversion, expungement, about saying, we believe in young people that there can be a different path forward, that the system is not going to outperform neurodevelopment, not gonna outperform community, not gonna outperform families, right? We know that young people and families are experts in their own lives, so it's about saying, it's about trusting in that. And really about not throwing away young people and really digging in at every decision point along the way.
My apologies, I was just sitting here caught in thought, particularly listening to you all, but also just reflecting back on far too often there's a common thread between men who look like us, and that's something we gotta we gotta change. But two quick things, first here, you make sure you realize I'm getting older. Second of all, just to echo what everyone else said, man, I hear you, I see you, and, just make sure you stay locked in. Two, you know, what does that look like? I think just to follow up on kind of a little bit of what Sarah said, right? It looks like love, it looks like accountability, right? It looks like compassion, it looks like trust, right? It looks like safety, right? We're talking about treating, you know, youth and children as children. You know, what does that look like? It looks like holding each other accountable, right? Both as colleagues, as community members, as stakeholders, you know, to be our best selves and to show up, you know, for our youth when they need us, you know, the most, right? It's about taking the onus on ourselves to make sure we're equipping ourselves with facts about what's really happening out there, right? It's questioning why far too often in the media we hear everything about young Black and brown folks carjacking and stealing cars and loitering and hanging out. But how many stories do we hear about young Black and brown folks who are doing great things in their community? When was the last time you saw a story ran on any of your local news sites around that, right? It looks like being youth-centered, right? When we're thinking about interventions and we're thinking about services, right? Because none of our youth are the same, right? It's understanding that over 60% of young women who come into contact with the system are victims and survivors, right? That's a far different context to how we think of a young lady who's a runaway, right? When we understand that, right? Understanding that, again, over 75% of the youth who come into contact with the system are for what we consider our Part 2 offenses, right? That's a different way of thinking about what does that look like and what do we need to do. But more importantly, and again, this is something that Mary mentioned kind of in the beginning, it's not just working with that youth, but it's also what it looks like is working with the family, right? You know, I could go back to my time as being a PO and, you know, you're looking to send some youth to an out-of-home placement, right? And we spend $300,000, $600,000, right? I hear all this talk about boys, totem town, all these places needing to come back, right? You don't want to hear me talk about that particular issue, but, you know, we send these youth to these places at a cost, right? And we know our youth to do one or two things. They'll either conform, right, or they'll start to make changes, right? And then we take them from those particular institutions and then we put them right back over north and we say, now go out there and be your best successful self, right? Or I'm going back into an environment that doesn't have the structure that I was just getting used to, that doesn't have the mentorship, that doesn't have the affirmations, right? Where I'm called upon to be a young woman and a young man at a far earlier age than anyone else, right? So how are we working with the families, and not in a way to get more families wrapped up in the system, but to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's giving families the services they need, right? You know, many of our youth come into the system broken. Many families are broken. You know, a lot of folks don't need people to fix them. They just need you to walk alongside them while they put themselves back together, right? So how can we think about what does that look like, right? And to me, it's a number of all of those things. But again, it starts with each and every one of us, right? When we leave here today, not waiting on the next Sarah Davis symposium before these things become things that we really want to address and to look at, right?
Thank you. So you've each talked a little bit about what would it look like to treat children as children, and KJ, you touched on this in terms of prosecution of kids in adult criminal court and placement of kids in adult prisons. We know from the research that that increases the chances of rearrest and also increases recidivism, so it's not good for public safety. Can you talk a little bit about why, can you talk a little bit about how we can hold kids accountable without doing that? And I'll ask each of you to jump into
One thing that really stuck out to me, when Mary did her initial remarks in the opening, was that when they're reaching out to these families, when they're getting this list, and they're like, I didn't know what to do. Like, I'm not surprised, and thank you. That was my mom. She didn't know what to do. She had no idea. I was young, I was out of control, she couldn't control me, you know, but imagine if those services came in and I had, you know, somebody dispatched to get wraparound services such as myself. And so there's all kind of alternatives, you know, that being one of them, that you give the youth somebody that goes to the family, gives them wraparound services, gives them opportunities. It looks like opportunities, you know, it looks like support. It looks like folks that can understand them and that they can understand and relate to, being there to give them that support, you know, being there to give them the opportunity, being there to essentially, you know, these are our children. We gotta hold our children's hands still, you know. And if you don't hold their hand at that age, then, you know, they become somebody who feel like they were left alone and to fend for themselves. And so another thing too, being that, you know, when I was going through the juvenile system at that age, like, we were cast away for so long at a time, you know, like every juvenile placement I went to was like a year at the time, you know. And then I was in there with a bunch of folks at my age too that were there for separated from their family, from their community for a year or years at a time. And, you know, majority are not getting visits, majority are not, you know, you're going in there and a lot of these placements being far out, being, you know, I've been to Elmore Academy, I've been to County Home School twice, I've been to St. Cloud Children's Home, I've been to, you know, you name it, like I almost been through most juvenile assistance programs that were here at the time. And, you know, you so far out, you don't see your family, you have counselors or workers there that don't look like you, that haven't been through your experiences, that there's no relatability. It just teaches you how to like kind of manipulate that system and get out of it, you know, rather than having folks that are coming and giving them tools to come out and make a different decision and have a different opportunity, you know. So really just giving and creating those opportunities.
Yes,
Yeah, what I would add to that is that, you know, we have to be really mindful of the language that we're using, because we're using the word accountability, and accountability is not the same thing as punishment. People use those words interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. And in our system, if what we're talking about is accountability, what we need to be looking towards is making sure that the behavior that happened, that the harm that happened doesn't happen again. And that we're doing what we can to repair harm with the people or the community that has been harmed, right? And so that's fundamentally different than saying we must punish for the sake of punishment. And so if we frame it as accountability, and if what we actually care about is making sure it doesn't happen again, and that we are doing everything that we can to make victims whole, it puts a different lens on what that looks like, right? Because what we know then is, so for the first part of that, making sure that this doesn't happen again, that's that positive youth development framework. That's about putting in place interventions that are immediate, that are relational, that are community-based, that are effective, right? Anybody who's been around kids, I have little kids, knows that you cannot wait a month, you can't even wait like weeks, but you can't wait a month, 6 months, a year to put in place accountability measures and say, hey, remember that thing you did a year ago? Now you're gonna be held accountable for that. And I'm like, that was a lifetime ago for me, right? We also know that it has to be relational, right? And that we need to put in place to build on the strengths that young people and their families have, but also wrap around the supports and services that they need to be able to move forward and not re-enter the system, to not have this happen again. And a lot of that is related to mental health supports, access to education, basic housing, right? Like basic, meeting people's basic needs, job opportunities, employment tracks, opportunities to move towards the future. And then when we think about how do we make victims whole, right? That's about restorative practices, offering opportunities, and again, this has to be voluntary, right? Not all folks who have been harmed are ready to come to the table with the person that has harmed them. But we need to provide that opportunity. We need to listen to the people who have been harmed when they say, you know, this is where I'm hurting, this is what I need. We can't always meet every need. We have to acknowledge that too. And we also have to acknowledge that punishing a young person, sending them to prison for decades, isn't going to change what happened, right? It's not going to bring back the person that they maybe murdered, right? Like that person is gone and there's nothing we can do to bring them back. What we want to do is listen to folks who have been harmed, create spaces where they can safely be heard, where young people who have created that harm can hear about the ways that their impact they've impacted that person and their family and their community, their sense of safety, and where we can move forward, right, and achieve better outcomes, which is what will lead us ultimately to better community safety.
I feel like I should just preface this by, like I tend to do, that people have an understanding that when you talk about some of our youth who have committed some heinous acts, some might consider unforgivable, right? I mean, you'll never hear myself or a number of many of my colleagues say no child should ever be placed in secure confinement. At least for me, that's just not the reality. Unfortunately, some of our youth make some very poor choices, right? And they do have to be removed from society. From my perspective, that's just the reality. However, to Sarah's point, we have to make a decision. Is this about being punitive or is this about accountability? Is this about retribution or is this about restoration, right? Because those are different things when we talk about this. It's also understanding what it means to certify youth as an adult. One of my colleagues here who retired from the Department of Correction there for a number of years, it's understanding what happens with the youth when they are certified as an adult, when they reach that arbitrary number of 18, right? When I first started at the DOC, when I spoke out at Stillwater, and I got done speaking, there was a number of men lined up just who wanted to say hello, primarily because it was good for them to see somebody who looked like them, right? You talk about the familiarity, being comfortable. And then it got to the line and there was two young men there, right? And I myself could tell that they couldn't have been no older than 20 years old. But even just seeing the fear, right? And again, one of the distinct honors that I had while being a deputy commissioner is I sat on our lifers panel, right? Which for those who are given a life sentence with the possibility of parole, myself and the commissioner and other deputy commissioner reviewed them and then made a decision on whether or not they will be paroled. Before we would go through that process, we used to meet with the victims' families, right? I think it's always important to let victims' families speak for themselves, right? Because the one thing they wanted the most, I couldn't give them that back, right? But it was also across the board on a number of things, right? And I think victim families are entitled to that. You know, rather that be they wanted that person to remain locked up, you know, for the rest of their natural born life. Or for the others who said that, you know, the best thing that this young person could do for my family to fill this hole that I have is to become the best version of themselves, right? But when we have to understand, what does that look like to send a young person to prison, right? There is no separation once you get behind those walls, once you become 18 years of age. So we have a bunch of young people, because the number of services within our facilities, unfortunately, are backloaded, right? So if you're a young person in there, it becomes about survival, right? So you might rack up a lot of disciplines, right, during your first couple of years. If you're young in mind, not understanding that those things will come back to hurt you when you do come up on your time for release, right? It's like I used to ask someone, just because I've been sentenced to prison, does that mean that I've been sentenced to be victimized, to be extorted, right? You know, to be subjected to a number of the things that happen behind prison walls? We talked about a safe environment. We talked about imploring and running cog skill classes and all those things. Do we understand what that looks like in an institution, right? Is that really setting young people on a track, again, to come back into the community, right, with a chance at actually making it? So for me, when we talk about what does it look like to both, hold youth accountable while also acknowledging the seriousness of their offenses, is first understanding what does that mean when we talk about the certification of the youth and the challenges that they are going to face. And is that something that we feel is appropriate for our youth? Is that something that we can live with for our own family members and for our own youth who are coming up? So if you haven't had an opportunity to go out and visit, whether it be a youth facility or to go out and visit any one of our number adult corrections facility, I would encourage you to do so, right? I would encourage you to ask questions. We spend a lot of time on prevention, rightfully so, to keep folks out of the system, to keep young folks out of these facilities. But we also don't pay enough attention to what's happening when unfortunately we weren't able to work further upstream to prevent them from going into these facilities and what they are subjected to while they're there. Because we understood that, then I think it would give us more of a perception, more of an understanding as to why many of them come out and make the same choices, unfortunately, that they were making prior to them going in to these facilities, right?
Thank you, Chris. Cara, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'd put two more kind of points on this conversation. And I know we're talking about young people who cause serious harm here, but I don't, as a public health researcher, I can't help but go upstream a little bit. And, regardless of kind of what everybody's positionality is in the room, we need to learn and we need to have practices around meaningful and relational accountability. And, we talk about a school to prison pipeline, and what we don't talk about enough is how that impacts somebody like me, which is not that I'm gonna be funneled into prison, but I'm gonna be funneled into a mentality that believes prison is necessary, right? I am gonna watch somebody in kindergarten get removed from a classroom and be blamed for acting up in some way, right? And say accountability is somebody dealing with that behavior. It has nothing to do with the community and whether we were picking on him or and so we need to reimagine, right, what accountability looks like and what it means to be accountable to each other through our relationships. And we need those practices in schools and we need those practices in families. And so then we would know what it looks like when we get to a young person. First of all, we'd have a lot less harm in our communities, right, if we were actually accountable to each other and really building these skills of empathy and perspective taking and saying, you matter as much as I do here, how are we working together to solve this issue, right? We'd be a lot more emotionally intelligent as a society, which we could use. And we would have a lot more empathy for each other, which means we wouldn't cause each other as much harm. And we would know how to do this. We would know what it looked like, and we would have people who were harmed saying, absolutely, I want to, come together and talk about what my needs are, and I know how to name my needs after an incident because I was taught that in school. And as a young person who was harmed, I know how to name what the emotions and what was behind that incident. And so then we can come together and talk about it. So we would have those skills, right, by the time we're an adolescent and early adults. And then, we could build those practices into a system of accountability in those rare instances when we actually decided that kind of accountability to the state was going to be more important in this, in this situation than, accountability that a family and community can handle on their own. So, and then part of that kind of I just wanted to name, right, and try and link it to that as best as I can, but I, wanted to name the mindset, right, that holds these systems in place, and basically name for the white people in the room, right, the way in which we can listen to a story like KJ's and be like, oh, see, it did work. It does work for some people, and it's okay, the system that we have. And I need to name, right, that is part of the way the white racial frame works, to justify the system is to hear the story of a young person who has been through this system and has come out on the end and say like, okay, it works, it's not that bad. When the statistic, right, like everything you are sharing about your friends, your brother, right, like those stories matter too, and those are the way the statistics roll, right? Like this system, I would say, on purpose and by design, creates the outcomes that it creates, and it allows for a few exceptions of amazing, amazing people who can come out on the other end and live to tell the story. And we need to hear it for that, right? A system that hurts people who hurt people to teach them that hurting is bad, and we accept it because of who it harms and who it doesn't harm. So I just need to mean that.
Thank you, Cara. So we've covered a lot of ground this morning. You've all shared so many incredible insights and perspectives. So I want to conclude our panel with a question about, where do we go from here? What are the policy, practice, resource changes that are needed to ensure effective intervention for young people and accountability? And so if you could each just recap 2 or 3 of your sort of things that the audience, takeaways for the audience, that would be helpful. We can start anywhere.
Well, I guess I could go down the line and think about some tangible things at each entry point of the system, but I guess if we want to think about this, holistically, right? And when we understand the facts out there and the numbers, and we know again that 75% of the youth who come into contact with the system are for what we consider our Part 2 offenses, right? There's 75% of probably the current juvenile population that we can remove from being brought further into the system. And that's through things like diversion, right? That's the investment, into that. That's one of the things that we were fortunate enough through a federal grant, through OJJDP. We talk about our Minnesota Incentivized Diversion Program, right? So again, you talk about creating space, right? So that we can really provide services and have resources for those who actually need it. Because what we also know is once you introduce a youth into the system, the likelihood of them coming back increases by over 60%, right? We also know that the same is true not for those who come into contact with the system, but those who are currently on who are currently on probation. If you look at the number of youth who are currently on probation now, the vast majority are on probation for misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors, not for felonies, right? So what we are actually doing is causing more harm because we are widening the net and we are soaking up resources because of the fact that we tend to criminalize adolescent behavior, right? And so if we were able to, again, change the framework in the way that we look to apply our resources, right? And we really utilize things like diversion and we remove that subsect, that population from the system. Now we can approach legislators like Representative Feist, and instead of maybe asking for 100 million, maybe we can ask for 50 million because now that number has shrank, right? So now when someone calls and they have a youth who might be autistic, right? And there's no placement for them because there's no rooms or anything available because they've all been taken up, right? Because unfortunately for that youth, maybe their grandparent who was their sole guardian, right, was over them and they had an incident and that youth had to be removed. Well, there was no other place for that youth. So then you know what we say? Well, the only thing we can do now is keep that youth or that young person in detention, right? Well, that's because of the overwhelming pressure that we have on the system by so many youth who don't need to be there in the first place. So we can start looking at solutions like that. I think we free up both space and opportunity to really work with those youth who quote unquote need it the most, and we'll have more services and hopefully more opportunities for those youth to be successful.
Well, I'm gonna try and limit myself to just a couple of policy changes. I do have a lengthy list, but for purposes of this panel, I think we really need to look at the age of juvenile court jurisdiction, right? So I talked a little bit earlier about the lower age, right? 10 years old here in Minnesota, the international standard is 14. But we also need to look at the upper age, when we lose jurisdiction at 18, 19, or even quite frankly with extended jurisdiction juvenile at 21, we're really limiting what we have access to for young people whose brains are still developing until their mid-20s. And so that policy, that legislation structure that is set forth for us in statute, really we need to take a close look at shifting that so that we can make decisions within a framework that is informed by evidence and research. And then I think the other thing is we really need to invest in community-based continuum of care, which we're gonna hear more about in our next panel here. But it's very difficult to shift practices and shift our practices so that we're supporting youth and community when we don't invest in resources for our community to be able to wrap up those supports around kids and families. And we have to acknowledge, in Minnesota and undoubtedly across the country, but in Minnesota we have huge racial disparities, but two of the places where we have the highest racial disparities are in out-of-home placement and in adult certification, right? These places where we're most punitive with young people. In Hennepin County, almost every kid who's certified is Black or brown. And we have to look at that and look at ourselves and really say, would we allow this practice to continue if we were talking about white wealthy youth? And I fundamentally believe the answer is no. And so if that's the case, then we really need to look at how are we creating and investing in community-based resources so that we're not ending up in this place where we say we have no other option.
I'll say, firstly, I'll kind of second some things that both of you guys said. But spending less of that money, less of that investment on punishment and retribution, and investing more of it on community-based alternatives, community-based support, wraparound services, and not having those youth that we mentioned that are not in for those, because I understand that, some, very severe and egregious offenses, you have no other option. But the issue being that for so many of them that are not under that standard, we're casting away, That's how I circle back to my youth growing up and all the folks that I knew that got certified, which is, more than I can count on each hand and probably my feet. Not one that we're talking about really, or maybe one or two, were for murder. The rest being, gun offenses, maybe a robbery, drug offenses. And so, for our youth to be certified for, crimes that weren't violent or, that nobody was harmed in per se, that's something that needs to be reevaluated, which based on the numbers now I see is happening, but there needs to be more lean into that, and like I said, really just reallocating that money and that focus from, retribution and punishment to creating opportunities and investing in those wraparound services and programs that are supported and making sure that these youth have a support system and somebody that they know that they can call and that they can lean on, and that the families have support too. The families is a huge part of it, because if they don't know where to turn, these youth also become outcasts in their own family as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we need to call that out specifically, especially in a community and a society that refuses to regulate guns, for example, right? We will refuse to regulate guns, but we will send children to adult prison because they have a gun. So, what it looks like is taking seriously this idea of shared accountability and shared responsibility for what is happening in our society. And so, I would love every time, there are hard cases, right? Like, clearly, there are things that are horrible. And every time that happens, every time a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old does something horrible, I want everybody who touched that child's life to circle up and say, what is the accountability I hold for this? In what way did this child get pushed out of school? In what way did this child not get the after-school basketball and football opportunities that would have? In what way did this child, have 16 touches with a law enforcement agency, and not once did we care enough to say, something's going on here. And so who holds accountability when a 15-year-old murders an adult, another 15-year-old? We all hold accountability for that. We all failed it, and we need to take it seriously. And so wherever you sit in society, right, like you hold some accountability, and you could have done more to prevent everyone, and I could have done more to prevent every one of those cases. So we need to start talking about that in the public forum. We need to start acting like that. And then, yeah, absolutely, there else. Another policy piece I would hold up is we have a ridiculous statute in Minnesota state law about diversion that very explicitly basically says first-time petty offenders, should get diversion. And people then interpret it to be like only first-time petty offender, right? And like, how many young people do you know that once you tell them like, maybe don't do that again, are like, got it, never doing that again. I've got a 14-year-old. I tell him a lot of things repeatedly, and I really try and work on his environment so that like those things, I even have trouble calling them choices because we're implying, right, that there's this kind of slow and methodical weighing of risks and benefit, and like, yeah, I'm going down this path, right? Like, not happening in a 14-year-old's brain, right? Like, he's gonna get there, and I trust he is gonna get there. It's not right now. And so I'm just gonna have to do everything I can to, wrap him up with love and support, and I want that for every baby in this community and across this country. And we have got to get there in our systems, in our policies, in our practices, and every one of us touches something in a young person's life where we can change that.
So, wow, you all have so many great recommendations to think about here. So I think we're gonna do some Q&A here. Looking over at
My
this
colleague
one.
Josh over there is collecting them, and I know this is our first panel of the day, so this is how it's gonna go. Your questions from the QR code are going to Josh, and he will share them, and the facilitator will facilitate this process.
I text him, it's like the QR code doesn't work for my phone, that link works.
The link didn't work for you, okay, well, we will work on that on this upcoming break. But if you have questions that you couldn't put into the QR code, Jen is gonna walk around with some notepads.
The first question that came through is maybe more of a technical question, so it speaks to this policy focus. It's, could Minnesota realistically end adult certification? Otherwise, won't the numbers just simply go back up during a new administration? So what would that look like to end adult certification in Minnesota?
Sarah, do you wanna take that first one?
Yeah, the resounding answer is yes, we could make that policy choice as a state to end certification. It would require restructuring our statutes, so we would really need to look at, first of all, I just wanna say, a lot of Western countries literally don't certify children as adults. It doesn't exist. You go to places in Europe and, you might say, so what cases do you send kids to adult court for? Like none. No, but what about murder? No, like really none. They don't do it. So is it possible? Yes. Would it take a lot of work? Yes. So we need to fundamentally shift our statutory structure. As I mentioned before, we would need to be able to raise the upper age of juvenile court jurisdiction, meaning that, right now when a 17-year-old engages in behavior that causes really significant harm and they have a lengthy history of doing so, there's not a lot of options, right? Because they're gonna age out of our system. And so how do we, when we think about accountability, how do we shift that child's trajectory? We can't do that in 6 months or a year before they hit 19, right? We need to have the time and the resources to be able to do that. So yes, it can be done, but it needs to be done thoughtfully and and we need folks to speak up about that. That's something we want to see happen. Sorry, Jeff.
Does anyone else wanna add to that? Well, I would just add that I think, and I can't speak to Minnesota, but I can say that, there was a time when almost every state increased, the prosecution of kids in adult criminal court and placement of kids in jails and prisons, and we've shifted far away from that now. There's been dramatic reductions in that, and we know from the research that, increases the likelihood that kids will reoffend if you prosecute kids in adult criminal court. So I think from a public safety standpoint, it's a strategy that's had its time, and that states should be looking at ways to serve kids in the juvenile justice system instead.
I'm gonna bundle two questions together here because they both sort of relate to the correction system. The first is, what opportunities are there for corrections to treat children like children? And the second is, what are your thoughts on investing in quote unquote better facilities as they relate to treating children like children?
Curtis?
I'd say there's a number of plethora of opportunities for facilities to treat children as children. Starting at the front door with their jurisdiction over who they let into their facilities and who they choose not to, right? So don't let anyone tell you differently. The executive director or the supervisor at each one of these detention facilities holds the power arbitrarily to decide what youth they let into their facilities and what youth they do not. Which is why too often at times you will hear a law enforcement person say, I wanted to place this youth at this facility only for them to tell me that they were not going to accept them there, right? That's why these same facilities could tell you that, oh, I have an alternative to detention, which I'll put them on the other side of this facility, which means they still can't leave, they just don't have locks on their doors like they do on the other side of the facility. So everything that happens within these facilities, there's more than a number of opportunities to both design the facilities in a way that is more intentional, right? That is more youth-centered, right? And that goes from everywhere from the way that the walls look, to the way the carpet looks, to the way we design their quote-unquote cells, which again is why I implore all of you, if you haven't been again to any of these detention facilities, both the youth or the adult, please go to them, because it is not like summer camp, right? It is essentially juvenile prisons when you go to them, right? And so the opportunities to both change the design and the makeup in there rest with those who operate the facilities. And that's both on the juvenile and the adult side, right? The same thing is within our adult facilities, right? Now there's a lot of nuance that happens particularly on the adult side. And you all probably will know this, but as far as on the correction side at the state level, we only have one juvenile facility, that is Red Wing. Right? So we don't even have a youth facility, for young women, right? So we contract out with some of our local partners. So imagine that, right? Nothing geared toward our young women that is intentional about meeting their needs, right? And I think that also gets into another thing that we talk about, which is understanding. When I was with the work for the Department of Corrections, on any given day, I could tell you how many folks were incarcerated within our facilities across the state. There's not one of us up here right now that could tell you how many youth are incarcerated in our facilities right now across the state. So let alone knowing what's going in, and we can't even tell you what youth and how many youth are actually there. And that speaks to another one of the most significant needs we have, which is a central repository here in the state of Minnesota that holds juvenile justice data, right? So that any one of you could actually know how many youth are at what facilities, right? So that you have an opportunity yourselves to make a decision or a distinction between what you're hearing from the media, what's being portrayed, to what's actually happening. So the answer, I guess, in short, is yes and yes on both of those fronts.
I just want to say really quickly and lift up something Curtis said about what the actual facilities look like if you haven't been in them. These are prison cells, right? Steel bars on doors, concrete walls, really bright lights. I used to be on our state's JJAC, our state advisory group, and we went to Dakota County's facility for youth, and they have this new room, their sensory room. And it's got carpet, the walls are painted different colors, it's got almost like a beanbag, and it's a soft room, right? It's a soft space, and the director there was telling us that every day they have like kids waiting to go in that room. Every kid wants to be in that room, and they do so much better after they've been in that room. And then you look around at the rest of the place, and we're talking about kids who've experienced significant trauma, who might be dysregulated. And, you know, you put anybody in these cells, and of course they're gonna become more dysregulated, and you let young people be in a room where there's sensory tools, and it's soft, and the lighting is different, and, yeah, of course they, you know, right, let's center humanity, right? Like let's think about, yeah, and Curtis talked about this earlier, it's very easy to other the children that we're talking about because it's all black and brown children, they don't look like me, they look like Curtis and KJ, right? And yet the folks who are making decisions tend to look like me, right, and have my lived experience. And so we need to stop othering our black and brown children and say, would you leave your white child in that cell? Would you leave them in there in solitary confinement for days on end? So,
I'm gonna give one quick thing and then let KJ have the last word on this, because I wanna lift up part of KJ's stories, which was I did not come out of those places wanting to be a doctor, lawyer, basketball player, football, right? Like, so we have to revert, I mean, if we're gonna try this, which I have some deep skepticism about, what I would suggest is that every one of these facilities puts Gisela Kanapka's conditions for healthy youth development on the wall, which ends with building the capacity to cultivate joy and learning. And, lots of other things around learning, trying on different identities and learning their own personal value system and their own identity. That is what we are robbing children of when we lock them up. And if we're gonna lock them up, we have to remember that they are still adolescents and they still deserve to become adults who have gone through this stage of adolescence in a somewhat healthy way. So, that's just one concrete thing. Put Gisela's list up and then and remind children that they can have a future and that dream that they had is not dead just because they did a thing, right? Like, we can get back on track for that, and that's what we're gonna do while you're here. And then we're gonna and then on the front end, we're putting you here because we all agreed that you need to go here, right? And that includes you and your family. We talked about what your needs are, and we decided that there is some intense treatment. And so we're going here with family support. We're putting in a plan that is aimed at healing, and then there's a back end coming out that reinforces everything we learned, and also includes family and support so that you actually can kind of stay on track.
I say that one thing is that, if we're gonna have programs like this from juvenile to adult that juveniles are going into, there needs to be an extreme amount of thoughtfulness and intentionality placed into the structures of how these places are developed and run. Because one thing that, I think majority of folks might not realize is that the most violent units are always the unit that all the shorties are in.
Yeah.
The unit that all the youngsters are in. When you go into prison, you don't have the option to just, number one, like not work, not go to school, not do anything. When you don't have a GED yet or a high school diploma, you have to go to the school unit. And the school unit is always the most violent unit in any prison I've ventured to say across this country. 100% in this state, but I've ventured to say across the country. And that's where you got all the youngsters, that's where you got everybody that, all the older guys that don't care either, all the older ones that might be 30, 40 and still don't have their high school diploma, GED, whatever. And what happens is you get in a perpetuating cycle. You are in this you are in the unit with most of the young folks, the most violent, the most volatile, and you go to the hole. You have an incident, you go to the hole. You get out the hole, you go to the SHU unit, the secure housing unit. You either go right back to the hole and then right back to the SHU and right back to the hole and right back to the SHU. Or you go from the SHU back to the school unit, that's the most violent unit, and then you go back to the hole and back to the SHU, and you get caught in this perpetual cycle of violence where sometimes folks that went to prison at a young age are in their mid-20s, 30, and still haven't obtained a high school diploma, GED, or anything of the sort. And it's because you're placed in these environments where these are the most volatile, the most violent units. Sometimes they're like, man, I want to just get a job over in industry and just chill, but I can't. I'm in a unit with all the gangs. I'm in a unit where everybody's pushing. I'm in a unit where I gotta fight. I'm in a unit where they're stabbing, where they're jumping, where everything's going on a daily basis. And I'm caught in this perpetuating cycle where I can't get out of this unit. So where's the thoughtfulness and intentionality in creating an environment where that doesn't have to be what it is all day, every day?
So, we are out of time for our panel. I know we have more questions. The good news is if you stay all day, at the end, our fourth panel, the vast majority of that time will be spent taking audience questions and engaging in dialogue. The other good news is these folks are here all day, so we're gonna take a break. We're gonna come back at 11 o'clock for our next panel. And I hope you all will come back on time because as you see, we have a lot to cover and a lot to get through. Really appreciate all the questions. I know there's some we didn't get to. Please approach any of us and also please stay till the end of the day because we'll have more of these conversations.
Please join us in thanking our panel.